They say repeatedly, and this is not false, that no world has made more victims than it has. But the opposite proposition is equally true. Our world is also and by far the best of all worlds, the one that saves more victims than any other. And even more puzzling than Girard's just mentioned paradox, that our world creates the most victims, while simultaneously is also helping the most victims, is his insight into how victimhood has become an instrument of power in our modern society. Those are bold statements and also interesting statements, and we will get to them now one by one. Girard's claim is that there is one universal ethic in contemporary society, the modern concern for the victim. It is the one non-negotiable in the theory of relativism. We all care, more or less, about the victims. The care of victims is somehow deeply anchored in our societal ethics, and we notice that by being bombarded from media or social media of the existing of all kinds of different victims. New hidden victims of society are continuously being brought to light. The consensus against them always dissolves after a while. First it was slaves, then the lower classes, then people of different ethnic and religious backgrounds. Today, the victimization of ethnic groups, of women, of handicapped people, of the very young and the very old is coming to light. But we also hear that we are indifferent to victims, that we are guilty of not helping more or of not helping at all. Never was a society, we often hear, more indifferent to the poor than ours. Yet, how could this be, since the idea of social justice, as imperfect realized as it may be, has found nowhere else? It is a quite recent invention. As a matter of fact, our society is the most caring for victims. When we have a look at ancient societies, we don't read much about victims in the first place, and we read even less about the care of victims. Yet our society blames itself that it produces absolutely, like looking, the most victims, which can be actually argued for. But it also blames itself for caring less and less, which is probably not true. Even more problematic is that in our times, victims are used for power. Either they get used for power by others, or they use themselves to get power by putting on themselves the label of a victim. This exaggeration that we use victims for power, to better understand this, we have to go back to the origin of our modern concern for victims, and that is, in Girard's view, Christianity. To understand the origin of our concern for victims, we must start with Girard's concept of mimetic desire. Humans, according to Girard, don't desire objects or goals autonomously. We desire what others desire precisely because they desire it. This imitative nature of desire leads to mimetic rivalry, when two or more people desire the same thing. As people imitate each other's desires, these rivalries multiply and spread throughout the community, like a contagion. Eventually, the object of desire becomes secondary to the rivalry itself, and the community descends into a crisis of undifferentiated violence, what Girard calls a mimetic crisis. Since the pressure has to get out of the system and the conflict has to be solved, people use violence. Ancient people likely fought, all against all. The stronger won, but heavy losses on both sides. This form isn't sustainable for any group. Over time, the ancient civilization, unconsciously in Girard's view, developed rituals. In these rituals, the guilt was placed on one human, on one victim, which we call here the scapegoat. This refers to the escalating to the extremes or polarization of a group during a social contagion into an all-against-one unity that ends in the murder or expulsion of the victim or the scapegoat. Through this act, the community is released of its tension and stress due to its interpersonal and communal mimetic conflicts by venting them all upon the victim. The one victim, in this case, takes all the guilt from the community and stops the circle of reciprocal violence from escalating between the members of the community. We move from all against all to all against one, and connected with the victim or the scapegoat is a scapegoat mechanism. Girard refers to the sacrifice of one for the good of the many as a scapegoat mechanism or single victim mechanism. He refers to scapegoating as a mechanism because it follows a sequence that produces only two outcomes, success or failure. Girard maintains, however, that the mechanism is not deterministic for at least two important reasons. First, variability of the scapegoat, and second, the possibility of failure. Regarding the first, the mob selects the victim arbitrarily, but not randomly. Victims often exhibit irritating qualities, for example a troublemaker, or exceptional physical qualities, for example beautiful or ugly. Marginality at the top or bottom of society, for example the king or the poor, as well as non-membership in the community, for example a stranger, also make one a more likely scapegoat, as does abnormal conduct. For this whole scapegoat mechanism to work, the crowd mustn't think the victim is innocent. They must believe that the victim is guilty. Another important point, before Christianity came, those rituals were mostly narrated from the perspective of the ruler or the persecutor. Introducing now Christianity, which put an overwhelming focus on the victim and narrated from the perspective of the often innocent victim. Christianity laid the scapegoat mechanism open. From then on, the mechanism of killing one victim to get release of pressure in the community was mostly not working anymore. Because people questioned more and more if the victim is guilty or not. And even if the victim is guilty in some cases, for example, in many cases it is not more guilty than other members of the community. Even if this one particular mechanism is mostly not functioning anymore, we invented many others. Maybe ours are not so much based on physical violence, but they can be based on mental violence. The scapegoat phenomena, to blame it all on one person, or in general just to blame it on another person, is still everywhere around us. Let's say I denounce my neighbor's scapegoating with righteous self-satisfaction, but I continue to view my own scapegoats as objectively guilty. My neighbors, of course, don't hold back from denouncing me for the same selective insights that I point out in them. Scapegoating phenomena cannot survive in many instances, except by becoming more subtle, by restoring to more and more complex causalities in order to elude the self-criticism that follows scapegoaters like their shadow. Let's do a short recap. Through Christianity, we arrived at our concern for victims. Why? Because Christianity plays a big focus or big awareness on victims. They narrate it not from the position of the stronger, of the king or of the persecutor, but they narrate it from the view of the defender, of the victim. And from this, we got our concern for victims, like according to Girard. We can argue that this is a moral advancement, especially compared to older societies, right? That we want to take care, want to protect the victim. But as we are specialists in this, that we have something good, which is objectively, so to speak, good, and we drive it too far and make it bad. Another indirect testimony is a very perversion of that concern for victims, which is highly visible in our world. The constant effort on the part of many groups and individuals to usurp the now privileged position of the most victimized victim, and thus to turn the concern for victims into an instrument of power, and even into a paradoxical tool of persecution. All this reveals the infinite resourcefulness of man when it comes to transforming the best into the worst, but it does not provide us with an excuse for not acknowledging the best in the world around us and in our lives. How can this look like now in our world? How are victims used for power? One example is the recent COVID crisis and the behavior of governments and people. In the name of health and security, opposite conclusions were drawn. Each group accused the other of sacrificing someone, either the elderly, the immunocompromised, and the poor, or the young, the healthy, and the self-employed. One side might argue, how dare you to not protect the old and the thick? The other side may counter, how dare you to not protect the young and the self-employed? It is now here not so much about who is more right or more wrong. It is much more about to use victims for one's own cause, to use a victim as a tool of persecution against each other, right? Like the person who said probably, how dare you to not protect the old and the thick, is probably not even old and thick, right? It's not by itself a victim, but it just uses the argument of the victim. The same we can, of course, say also for the other side. The point is here that we use, or groups of people often use victims as a tool of persecution. And now consider here that not just governments or big group of people are doing this, but also individuals. Consider this. The victims most interesting to us are always those to condemn our neighbors. And our neighbors do the same. They always think first about victims for whom they hold us responsible. The point is that we tend to make use of victims against others, that we use them for our own cause, not just big groups of people, also we individually. And it is always easy to blame others, to find fault in others, but it's extremely difficult to find fault or to blame ourselves. And another example how some people use victims for power for their own cause is the example of political correctness. The concern for victims has become such an absolute value that it has become the unspoken dogma of political correctness and victimization. Political correctness surrounds most of our public institutions, including, above all, colleges and universities, with an aura that prohibits using any word or allowing any discussion that might offend some minority group or victim or potential victim. It tends to stifle public discussion and debate of ideas and issues. Victimization uses the ideology of concern for victims to gain political or economic or spiritual power. One claims victim status as a way of gaining an advantage or justifying one's behavior. Now, before we talked the whole time how victims get used for power, but here in this quote, Girard also mentioned that victims more often using themselves for power by putting the label on, like that I am a victim, like fake or real, and by that they gain extra status, they gain power through it. Like as Girard said, they justify their own behavior by being a victim. There are many real victims out there who deserve our attention and care, and there's no doubt about it. The point is just that we have to be careful when some groups or some people use those victims for their own power, and also especially be careful when victims, real or fake, use themselves as, like with the victim status, for like power, like to get by themselves more power because they are victims. And exactly this exaggeration of the, in my opinion now, morally good Christian starting point of putting more light on the victim and putting more light on the mostly innocent victim to give them care is now exaggerated in our modern world, like not all the time, right? But in some cases, that people are using those victims for power or victims use themselves for power. Not that we create a world where the loudest victims, those who make the most drama around themselves, get all the attention, but the quietest ones, those who do not complain, those who do not make a drama about themselves, those who do not use their position for power, which probably needs our attention or like needs the world's or society's attention or care the most, don't get any. Girard's arguments are an indirect reference to the increasing violent struggle in the modern world to be viewed as the victim, which in contemporary debate is also being interpreted as a radicalized victimology. As mentioned before, it is most likely beneficial for us when we label ourselves as a victim. But now I want to shortly show you another view which says this is pretty disastrous or like pretty dangerous to label ourselves and to see ourselves as a victim, even if we are. And with this we end now the topic of René Girard and our concern for others, like our concern for others as a victim, and enter now the concern for ourselves, if we are a victim or not. And I will rely here mostly on the words by Charlie Munger and his idea of a victim mindset. Whenever you think that some situation or some person is ruining your life, it's actually you who are ruining your life. It is such a simple idea. Feeling like a victim is a perfectly disastrous way to go through life. If you just take the attitude that however bad it is in any way, it is always your fault and you just fix it as best as you can, the so-called iron prescription. In Charlie Munger's quote, he exactly describes the opposite of the victim mindset. He describes the iron prescription. The victim mindset is that what he talks about as a disastrous way of going through life is that we think that everything is unfair, that the world is against us, that we are just complaining about our situation, that we don't feel that we have agency, that we are a victim from someone or the world or from whomever. But to adopt this mindset is pretty dangerous for ourselves. My thoughts on this are that we are living in a culture where the victim mindset gets reinforced. And this is exactly the danger, like to adopt this mindset. Because most likely in ancient societies, they were not even thinking about this victim mindset or they would even ignore it. But in our culture, it gets reinforced. When someone is now a victim, let's say real or fake victim, okay? But let's say this is a victim with a horrible life situation. And this person posts his or her horrible life situation for the sake of getting sympathy and pity for this life situation, post it online. What happens? Most likely this person will get sympathy and pity, right? Because we of course feel with the person, we are concerned with the victim. Now the problem is that this victim gets now positive feedback and it, let's say, not likes to be like the victim, right? Like this sounds now really bad, but it gets like this positive feedback. And so why should it get out of this victim status, right? Because now let's say the horrible life situation is over, the victim is cured or the victim is not poor anymore or whatever this victim defined as their horrible life situation. Let's say this situation is over and now the victim doesn't have anymore the sympathy from the outside, this pity from the outside, right? And this is for some people unbearable. So they try to figure out that they're a victim from another thing, right? They just figure out another situation, what makes them a victim. And exactly this is so disastrous because with the victim mindset that we are like unfairly treated, that the world is unfair, maybe the world is even unfair, but this is not the point. The point is that when we have this mindset, we have no agency. We feel that we can do nothing, and this is disastrous, not just for ourselves, but also for the people around us. Thank you so much for watching this video today. I hope you got some value out of it. And when you want to discuss with me some points, or some theories from Girard, or when you have something to add or something to change, or when you just want to discuss something, write me down in the comments below. When you want to hear more about René Girard's ideas, especially about the mimetic theory, which I mentioned shortly in the second chapter, watch this playlist here. Thank you again for watching, and as always, I wish you a great day.